All right, guys, we're going to take the opportunity to do a brief introduction to Unit 3. This is the third of the four units we'll be addressing this semester in Amstead. And it's one that deals with the time period after the War of 1812 from roughly 1816 to 1848. And so what ends up happening is over the course of this period, America begins to come into its own as a nation for the first time. And while states' rights will be an issue throughout this time period, people for the first time thought of themselves as Americans. And there was a sense of identity as Americans that was pervasive throughout the country, really for the first time since the country's inception. At the same time, America began to assert itself economically. And although there was considerable instability over the course of this period, there was profound economic growth through the period. There was profound economic diversity emerging through the period. And the earliest stages of industrialization will take place, the earliest stages of urbanization will take place. A considerable amount of investment in transportation will take place that's going to fuel economic growth in this time period. And so as we begin, there is kind of a holy trinity that begins to emerge of economic nationalism. Economic prosperity following the War of 1812 fed the sense of well being and began to enhance the prestige of the federal government. That Jefferson's embargo that we talked about in Unit 2, followed by the wartime constraints on trade, that gave impulse to factories. That when America needed those goods during the war and couldn't get them from overseas, America began to produce them. And the war in Europe also led to, shortages of farm products, which forces up the price of American products overseas and stimulates agricultural expansion. And so the idea begins to spread that the country needs a more balanced economy of manufacturing and commerce and agriculture. And so this wave of nationalism sweeps over in terms of trying to find an identity that allows for people to look at the economy as a whole and not just what's good for their region. So the first step of this is the creation of a second Bank of the United States, a second national bank. We mentioned earlier that Hamilton's bank was given a 20-year charter that expired in 1812. And the lack of a Bank of the United States during the War of 1812 really embarrassed the federal government. There was no means of floating loans, nor any way of transferring funds across the country, and state banks began creating some economic chaos. And so Congress adopts a new national bank in 1816. And the debate over the bank really set the pattern of regional alignment for a lot of other economic issues. We talked about this really briefly with the rise of the bank, and we often think of, regional issues looking more north-south, but there is kind of an east-west dynamic going on here as well. That currency-strapped Western farmers are going to feel that they're at the mercy of the centralized Eastern Bank. But the Bank of the U.S. will begin to emerge and provide some economic stability in the wake of the War of 1812. You also see the first real support for a protective tariff in this time period. We mentioned this again with Hamilton's financial plan. And the post-war era brings in an influx of cheap British goods, goods that couldn't be sold during the war because of the blockades. Well, now all those stockpiles of British goods flood American markets and drive the prices of goods down, which means that American manufacturers who began producing some of those goods are going to cry out for protection. And so this is going to be reinforced by a patriotic desire for economic independence. Some New England shippers are going to oppose it because they're afraid it's going to drive down trade or lead to tariffs on American goods. Some large farmers oppose it because they believe that it's going to lead to retaliatory tariffs from Europe on their goods. But the fact of the matter is that most people really kind of bought into the idea that this is a good idea to protect American industry and allow for economic growth and economic diversity to emerge as a result of that. Congress passed the Tariff of 1816. It's the first protective tariff in American history, meaning it's designed to do more than just raise revenue. It's designed to artificially inflate the price of imported goods in order to protect American industries. It'll be somewhat popular at the time, but it's going to set the stage for debates over tariffs for really the rest of the next century here in the United States. Finally, there'll be support for internal improvements. And this is going to be a debate that's going to go on for a while about whether this should be done at the federal level or at the state level or with private or funds instead. And the debate will break down along sectional lines. The South and the Northeast will oppose internal improvements because it's going to benefit them the least. They've been around for a long time. The West supports it. And while the debate will go on over the course of this entire time period, you will see investment in infrastructure, in roads, in canals, and later on, even in railroads. And the result of this, by the end of the period, by the end of the unit, will be this so called market revolution, that America becomes integrated into a national economy for the first time. It's going to be characterized by regional specialization that you see here in the map. And we'll come back to this over the course of this time period. All right, so the second big pursuit of American identity is going to be tied to a new political identity. And that's going to start really with the so-called era of good feelings. You know, in the election of 1816, Madison will pick his hand-picked successor, James Monroe, continuing the Virginia dynasty as his successor. The first years of his presidency, there's a lot of political harmony. He goes on a goodwill tour of the Northeast, and somebody comments that it's an era of good feelings, in large part because there's no inter-party fighting, because the Federalist Party died off and there's not two parties anymore. And so there is kind of a sense of well-being that goes along there. And even when troubles are going to resurface, little of that blame falls on Monroe. He's elected in 1820 almost without opposition. The Federalist Party is too weak to put up a candidate. He gets all the electoral votes but one. So to this day, George Washington is the only one to get all the electoral votes. But even the sense of unity caused by a lack of inter-party fighting was going to be short-lived. And there'll be several events that are going to bring about the end of the era of good feelings. The first of which is the Panic of 1819. A sudden collapse of cotton prices that sets off a decline in demand for other American goods that goes along with that. And you're going to find that anytime that there's a panic of insert year, one of the causes will be over speculation. It's just a matter of what the commodity is that they're over speculating in. In this case, it's Western lands. Okay, a lot of people had bought out Western lands as they, were planning for westward expansion, but soon the supply of land, outpaced the demand for land, and so people who had taken up loans to buy this land couldn't pay those loans back because the prices they were trying to sell them at did not allow them to recoup their loans. And you're going to find the combination of the collapse of cotton prices and the collapse of land prices left speculators short. Okay, state banks that had made loans fairly recklessly in this time period found themselves in real trouble. Now, the Bank of the U.S. is going to save itself by calling in loans from those state banks. State banks are going to try and save themselves by calling in loans from speculators and landowners. And a lot of business owners, a lot of farmers in the West are going to lose their farms, lose their businesses, Andrew Jackson among them. And hard times are going to last for about 3 years. The Bank of the U.S. will take a lot of the blame for this. And that's set the stage for pretty vocal, pretty vicious debate over the bank in the early 1830s. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. But there's an economic panic. It's going to be the first, death knell of the era of good feelings. The Missouri Compromise will be a second. By 1819, the country had an equal number of slave and free states. There's 11 of each. But the population is growing faster in the North. And that means that the North has an advantage in the House. And by extension, if you think about it, the North has an advantage in the Electoral College. So the Senate really is a place where there's a very tenuous balance of power between slave and free states. And when Missouri petitioned for statehood, that sparked heavy debate about whether or not slavery should be expanded into the Louisiana Purchase territory that comes along with that. The debate really didn't figure out about the moral issue of slavery. The debate was a lot more about the idea of whether Congress had the authority to determine whether there was slavery in those states or not. Okay, Southerners wanted the states to be able to expand slavery; others did not. And really, the argument at this time was if they wanted to end slavery, if Congress wanted to end slavery, it'd be a violation of the Fifth Amendment. We mentioned that earlier, that if the Congress is going to end slavery, that they have to give due process and just compensation for those slaves, meaning they have to pay for them all. And so there's a big debate about this, and a big debate about what Congress's role would be in regulating slavery in new states. It all kind of comes to a head when Maine applies to be a state, and that eases the situation. When Maine applies to be a state, remember at this point it had been part of Massachusetts. Maine comes in as a free state. Missouri comes in as a slave state. Henry Clay will broker this compromise, and he'll bring in those two states, one slave, one free, and then he'll ban slavery in the Louisiana Purchase territory north of a line at 36 degrees 30 minutes, the southern border of Missouri. And that will be kind of a compromise that's going to stay in place until the 1850s. It also kind of sets a precedent where slave and free states will come in, together as pairs within a year or so of each other. And so the debate over slavery is already starting to take hold and already becoming an issue as early as 1820. And the Missouri Compromise and debate over that will be one of the things that's going to help bring about the end of the era of good feelings. The last big nail in the coffin of the era of good feelings is the so-called corrupt bargain of 1824. The results of the 1824 election were inconclusive in the Electoral College. No candidate had a majority. Andrew Jackson had 99 votes. John Quincy Adams had 84. William Crawford, former Secretary of War, had 41 votes, and Henry Clay had 27. This is significant because the Constitution says that when there's no majority in the Electoral College, the election goes to the House, and it's decided between the top three vote getters, which means Henry Clay is out. However, because he is Speaker of the House, he has decisive influence, and he does not like Andrew Jackson. So he throws his support in the House behind John Quincy Adams. The final vote goes down by state. Adams wins 13 states. Jackson wins 7. And although there is no evidence that Adams entered any kind of bargain with Henry Clay, the charge was made that that was the case. And that was made more prominent by the fact that John Quincy Adams appointed Henry Clay to be Secretary of State. That's significant because if you look back in history over the course of this period, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, John Quincy Adams, what do they all have in common before they became president? They're Secretary of State. And so the Secretary of State position was seen as kind of a springboard to the presidency. To reward Clay with that was seen as unseemly. And so Jackson supporters lose their minds. And you're going to find out over the course of this unit how that's going to play a role in really mobilizing a new sort of campaign that comes along with that. Okay. Tied to this, then, the era of good feelings goes away, and you start seeing the origins of the so-called Jacksonian democracy that comes along with that. Now, defining Jacksonian democracy is tricky. Really what it boils down to is that as over the course of the 1820s, states drop property ownership as a requirement for voting. And so the states do that. Jackson doesn't do that. States do. But Jackson's the biggest beneficiary of that in the early stages of this new universal white male suffrage. Okay? And so loosely defined, Jacksonian democracy refers to a series of reforms that is geared towards empowering the common man in America. Okay? It's often associated with popular sovereignty, the rise of the common man, debates over the nature of the federal government between states' rights and federal power and who has more of which, and financial instability in some ways. It can also refer to an impulse tied to slavery and a subjugation of Native Americans and a celebration of white supremacy, depending on who you ask. There's going to be some of each in all those things. And so it's a really ambiguous and controversial term. If you look at the origins of this wing of Jacksonian democracy, the people who are Jacksonian Democrats, you can trace them from the American Revolution. These were the anti-federalists. These were the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. And their views are changed by the profound economic and social changes that are occurring over the course of this period. The market revolution will play a big role in this. Rapid immigration, rapid transportation changes, the rise of cash crop agriculture on a larger scale, as well as capitalist manufacturing. You see a big economic boom, just not for everyone. And so you find that, the changes that occur in the wake of the War of 1812 are especially troubling for small farmers who, are mortgaged, who owe money to banks. It's hard for a rising working class in the Northeast. It's hard for non-slaveholding whites in the South. And it's hard for, yeoman farmers in the West that are just barely holding on. They see this economic boom as a source of dependence. And they're fearful that old elites are going to block their efforts to make a name for themselves and to, try and succeed economically. They're going to see the rise of these newly founded corporations as a threat to themselves economically and a threat to American democracy. And the government does not really help with that. There's an increasingly centralized view of government that takes place over the course of this period, helped in part by John Marshall's court decisions that are going to put more power in the hands of the federal government, as well as the corrupt bargain and the debate over things like Henry Clay's American system, where the government would be involved in building roads and canals and those kind of things. And so, there is this celebration of common man democracy, but also fear of consolidation of power in the hands of old elites. So, over the course of this period, then, you see these things combine into efforts to create a new American character. And that's going to take a couple of forms. First, it's going to be a celebration of the common man in this time period. It's also going to be led to reform movements to improve American society. And so when you look at this new political character is characterized in large part by how we perceive politicians. In the 1830s and 1840s, many advisors and politicians, sometimes even common people, could knock on the door and see the president of the United States. The president didn't have minions. The president didn't have, the Secret Service. That's a 20th century phenomenon. And so you find that the White House became kind of a cultural center, and the people of the time period began to really associate their leaders with being more common like them. We'll see how that's going to play out in American politics a little bit later on. But as you start seeing the end of property requirements for voting, a lot of time will be spent mobilizing that common white male vote. That politicians are going to have to reach out to common folk in a way they didn't have to do beforehand. And they came along with that America embraced this new egalitarianism in a number of ways, things we wouldn't think of. That handshaking became common as opposed to bowing. That nicknaming of military heroes and political candidates became a big deal. That candidates for office became more average Americans, as it were. And what you find is that as there is a growing economy, as there is a politically active population, that's going to lead to efforts to create an American character that goes along with that. That nationalism and nativism are going to emerge at the same time. And as we're putting more power into the hands of common people, you're going to see an effort to try and improve what those people are like. You're going to see the push for things like education as a result of this. That as immigration becomes prominent, the idea of trying to, on one hand, show American cultural superiority, and on the other hand, trying to keep immigrants from undermining American democracy, there's going to be a push to educate immigrants as part of this. You're also going to find that if we're going to put more power in the hands of the common people, it would make sense that they were sober. It would make sense that they were educated. And there's debates about, who has those rights. Black people, white people, do women have rights? That's a big part of this discussion in the time period. And all of this is going to be fueled by a second Great Awakening that encourages salvation by good works, and it encourages people to take action to improve the lives of the common person. And so this second Great Awakening, combined with this new political character, leads to a series of reform movements that are going to really define a lot of this time period. Finally, as we're trying to create a new American character, there is also an attempt to establish a new separate American cultural identity. And it's during this time period that we see an initial outpouring of American art, American literature, even a little bit of American music that is tied to American themes and not just copying what we saw from Europe. And so writers like Melville and Hawthorne and Poe, thinkers like Emerson and Thoreau, artists like Thomas Cole and George Caleb Bingham and John James Audubon and others are going to play a large role in really defining the first real outpouring of American culture. And we're going to spend a lot of time on that over the course of this unit. So That's about all we have for today. We'll spend some more time again going over all these over the course of this unit, but I wanted to give you a preview of what Unit 3 is going to look like and kind of give you a sense of how to fit all of these things together. The rest of these things will be coming soon, and I hope you have a really good day.